Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of human beings at work. I am Linda Stacy, and I am a corporate sellout who likes to think of herself as a corporate innovator. And I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck. And this podcast is on a journey, a mission to prove these points. When and how do we make it not suck? Admittedly, working in corporate does suck a lot of the time. Up to 80% of the workforce is dissatisfied, unsatisfied, disengaged in their work. And on the flip side of this, the paradox here is that more and more human beings are expecting to really create meaning and purpose within their lives through the work that they do. This is where many people get their identity from. And with the pandemic and the Great Resignation, all of this has forced us to take a closer look at what quality of life means when you work for these organizations and what culture really means inside of these organizations. I always like to point out that I think that business is a very cool thing. I think that building things, that solving real world problems, this is like hallmark of the human experience, being able to envision something and then have it be created and then employ people and then have it last years and years later. It's a huge feat of human potential, but there's a lot of humans that are suffering within these environments too. Today, I talked to Stuart Pink, and you're going to hear he's British, and he has quite the career history. He started in law in the UK, working within the system there, and then transitioned into corporate law. He has been a teacher. He is now an entrepreneur, and we're going to talk about all sorts of things. So this career history, the highlights, some of the crazy things that happened to him in his career. We talk about his projects now, last minute speaking, how to speak well, even when you don't have a ton of time. Stuart has done so much, and it's great to chat with him today, even about the differences between the American and the UK education systems and how he sees impacts for better, for worse in these environments. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Linda.
It's good to talk to you today.
Yes, you too. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, totally. I want to give folks an idea of how you and I met. It was, I think, probably 5 or 6 years ago in person at an NSA meeting. And then more recently, we've been kind of reacquainted through online meetings. And then I wanted to create a story group last year to practice, stories and things that we do in speeches. And you stood out as someone that we should definitely have in this group. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the podcast. But overall, you have focused on creativity in your life and in your world. You're an entrepreneur. You have a Toastmasters champion, which you'll have to tell me what the actual awards are that you won there. Thrilled to have you on today. We're going to talk about your career history. I've been calling this your career story, if that's a thing. I love your insights overall. It's so fun to chat with you. Like to hear, of course, about the fun projects that you have going on right now. And of course, the fantastic book that is in production, Last Minute Speaking or Speaker. You can clarify on that. And so we'll talk about all those things today. And of all the things I just said in this introduction, based on my, view, through my lens, what would you add, or would you correct anything? Or
not at all. I think it's really interesting to get to this stage in life and think, gosh, isn't it a journey? And there have been so many different steps of the journey, and they all add up to where I'm at today. So I'm really looking forward to today to look back at some of the things that have happened, but also look at how they've made me who I am today and how I survive the world of work, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, talking to people about this, the fluidity of career, if you want to call it that. I think sometimes when folks are earlier in their career, there might be this expectation that we need to have a really clear vision. And some folks do have a really clear vision. From our conversations previously, you started out, you said from the age of 13, knowing that you wanted to be a lawyer. And then I just briefly that you weren't there long, you transitioned into corporate law, then became a teacher in England, and then moved to America. And a quick question, I wanted to know how long each one went, what was the duration between each of those, if I'm hitting the main ones,
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, my initial goal was very clear in my mind, and it was I think I was about 13, and it was because my mum had done jury service in the UK, and she came back and told us all about it. And I thought, wow, what a fascinating career of being a barrister, which are the trial lawyers that wear the wigs and gowns in the UK. So that's what I pursued, and did that for little more than a year after university and law school. And for a variety of reasons, thought maybe this career isn't the perfect career for me. There were lots of aspects I liked, but 20 years plus later, I'm looking at the career and thinking, yeah, I made the right decision. And so I hopped over to join a law firm, an international law firm. And I was with them for 6.5 years, both in London and also New York, because I qualified as a New York attorney during that time. And then at the end of that, I went back to England to train as a teacher. And I was teaching for about 2 years there before coming to America, which was about 11 years ago. And I did a bit of teaching in America as well. And then the more entrepreneurial path that you mentioned since then.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I hadn't heard the part before that having the experience of your mom doing jury duty,
Yeah.
essentially, as it's called
Yes,
here.
that's
And
right.
was there anything more to that? Like, what was your vision of what it was going to be like, and how did that differ from reality?
I think I thought it would be quite glamorous, but intellectually challenging. And it's taken me a long time to realize this, but one of the themes about all the jobs I've done that I've loved has been an element of speaking and public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously being an advocate in court has a public speaking role, although somewhat surprisingly to me, it felt like it wasn't maybe the major part of the career.
Mm-hmm.
And so this wasn't the explicit reason that I left, but I have a feeling that I had wished to be doing more of the actual courtroom advocacy than I got to do during my time there. I guess there was a lot of traveling and a lot of preparation and a lot of cases that don't go ahead. And when they do go ahead, they don't take
Mm-hmm.
that long.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not as much of the speaking role as I perhaps wanted it to be.
Interesting. So that's to the profession itself, and not like you had to do some time before you got more stage time, if you will. It was just the characteristic of the job. It was just a very
Yes.
small sliver that was
Yeah.
actually, yeah, that's interesting. Um, Overall, like you had in your corporate career, or actually in any aspect of any of your roles, I am eager or interested to hear stories of egregious or less than optimal things that happened in work environments. And
Mm.
I don't know if you have any top of mind at this point in any of those chunks, whether teaching or in corporate, or when you were working for the government. Like, were there any things that really surprised you?
I,
This usually that tips into human behavior and stuff. Yep, go ahead.
I think some of the most obvious things that surprised me actually probably come from that very first job of being a barrister, or being, I should say, I was a trainee barrister, and the terminology we use is pupil
Mm-hmm.
barrister
Mm-hmm.
back then. And it's a very small world, and quite an elite world in the sense of very hard to get into. And as a pupil barrister, you find yourself working for senior barristers, and you have to do more or less whatever they say, or it's going to be very hard to make it
Mm-hmm.
in that career. And so it's not exactly regulated in the way that a normal place of employment might be.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard stories of pupils being told to go and get dry cleaning
Mm-hmm.
for senior lawyers that certainly would fall outside their job duties. But I remember one afternoon being sent up to North London to a very senior lawyer's house. And he had a big fraud trial that he was preparing. And he asked me to go through some pages and pages, and just highlight certain numbers. And he said to me, see, this is great training, great practice for doing fraud trials. And I thought, no, it's not. I'm just highlighting numbers as a favor to you. And yet you obviously couldn't say that. I haven't really said that until now, all these years later. So that was very much a career where almost like you had to be seen and not heard until you made it. And I think that overall was probably one of my issues with the career. I think I believe in a meritocracy. I think if you work hard, you should be able to succeed. But it shouldn't be like you're working for a king until you yourself are a king.
Did you find parallels in corporate?
Nothing like to the same degree. I mean, when I worked for my law firm, I worked incredibly hard, but so did everyone around me, really. So it felt very much a kind of work hard, play hard environment that I was in, but it didn't feel like there was anything that was too unfair. I mean, I suppose, of course, it felt like maybe the partners at certain points would return home and you might still be in the office in the evening.
Right.
But I don't think that's a particularly unusual thing. I worked for a number of great partners who were always available, always able to help, and were real mentors, I think, in my career.
Yeah, I think there is something about doing one's time, and maybe there's better language around that, that I see in most roles, that, and even with the highlighting of numbers in documents, who knows if there was something else that could be learned in that environment or that experience that actually was impacting you professionally. I don't know. Maybe it was just making it clear what you didn't want to do going forward. But I know that in hindsight, I've had much more appreciation of things that may have felt like grunt work or, initially, and working longer hours potentially when you're earlier in your career seems to be the way. I think what I find interesting or to talk about are, it's more like the petty things that can turn into something that becomes untenable or and so, to the extent that maybe other things might occur as we go through. I think that these are the, like, what the F just happened type of moments.
I think you also just mentioned a key word there, which you said appreciation. And I think you meant it from our perspective as the workers, but actually being appreciated makes all the difference. And so I think in that first job, it felt like nothing you did, however reasonable or unreasonable, was really appreciated. And the justification was because once upon a time we were there too, and we had to put up with this nonsense.
Right.
Whereas moving into the corporate setting, there was a lot of appreciation, I think, for the job we did and how hard we worked. And that's okay. If you're appreciated, I think that really makes all the difference.
How is the appreciation demonstrated?
I think in lots of ways. I mean, obviously there is the being well paid aspect of it, but although I worked in a very large law firm, I worked in a very small group or department within that law firm. And so we did a lot together. We had a lot of fun. Our boss who ran the department would take us to places, sometimes to other countries for fun. And so I think there was that feeling of we would move heaven and earth for him because he really appreciated us. And it was one of those things. They say that you shouldn't be doing your job because of the people you're around, because people come and go. But on the other hand, it makes a huge difference if you really like the people that you're around. And it can be a motivator to turn up and even to stay late, I think.
Wow. That is pointing me, my brain is going to this work from home, the great resignation movement that's happening now. And, in professional services organizations like the one that I work in, this this internal struggle, or, you know, that I don't know if it's really a struggle. It's just there's a lot of unknowns right now as they reflect on what it was like prior to the pandemic. And a lot of what you're describing was the culture, you know, these, and it was mostly among the consulting staff, or in your case, you know, among the associates. I don't know what your rank was, if you will, within the firm, and how that's been lost, but something new is being created. And what is that? But anyway, it's an interesting place that we are in the
Yes.
evolution of this, and what it means to work in this type of organization. I imagine too that these different inflection points, you know, you've already said some of the things you're kind of learned along the way. How about the transition between corporate and education? You know, reflections about things that you learned about yourself, or what made the transition, what made it obvious that it was time to move on?
I think I don't know if burned out is too dramatic a words to use, or an expression to use, but I ended up working very long hours as a lawyer, and I didn't particularly enjoy the actual work that I was doing. I certainly, again, liked the people I was working with. That was great, but it felt like my life was disappearing. And actually, it was the time that I left to go into education was almost exactly the same time I became a parent. And so part of my thinking was, I'm not going to know my kids. If I don't make a change now, I will just never see them. So that was part of it. I think I'd always been interested in education, and it just instantly felt very interesting and rewarding to me. And I should say that in England, I trained to be an elementary teacher, or primary teacher, as we call them there. And that job in England means teaching every subject, not just ELA and math and maybe science, but doing the music and the art and PE and history, geography. And I absolutely loved it. I'm not saying I was good at all of those things, but it felt like there was so much learning going on. And that was the time I really, I think, rediscovered the importance of creativity. And then, of course, surrounded by children who are so creative, and my own children as well. So it felt like a very rewarding and fulfilling time. But then there was a parallel with that career that existed with my first two careers, which is it perhaps wasn't completely the job I thought it was. And there was teaching and education involved, but it felt like a great deal of social work involved. And I wouldn't say I was naive entering that career. I expected a degree of it, but probably not the amount that I encountered. I mean, for example, in my first year teaching, I had more meetings in social services offices than I had visits to other schools. That surprised me. But a great experience overall, and one I certainly am very glad that I did.
Do you, this idea around creativity, was there any opportunity for creativity that you could see within law?
It's a difficult one, especially because a difficult one to answer, especially because one of my mantras is that everyone is creative and you can be creative in any situation. So faced with the challenge of, okay, how can you be creative as a lawyer? It's not immediately obvious. It requires a bit of thinking. And the first thing that comes to my mind, of course, is, well, you can be creative with the law, and that gets lawyers into trouble. And maybe we're seeing a bit of that sometimes now. So that's not good. The second thing that comes to mind, and I did see some of this, is you can have very, very clever lawyers who create very creative structures, tax structures, corporate structures that work for certain deals. and they're good and bad. On the
Mm-hmm.
one hand, they can make a new deal possible. On the other hand, they may also have given us some of the financial crises that we've had
Mm-hmm.
over
Right.
the years.
Mm.
I I have a specific experience that I suppose you would say is connected to creativity when I was a lawyer that I found very, very disappointing. And I was quite junior at the time. I was probably in my first year with the law firm. And a group of us were assembled in London, and we were tasked with thinking about the law firm of the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so the facilitator, she wasn't a lawyer, but probably someone from human resources. She got us together and said, okay, imagine what will the law firm 20 years from now look like? And I thought, oh, this is really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I put my hand up and said, oh, lawyers will be able to choose the hours that they work. And she immediately responded with, well, that's never going to happen. And she may have been right, but the problem at that point was that I then shut down
Yeah.
because it felt like, I thought this was an exercise in brainstorming and being creative. And I realized it wasn't. It was just a box checking exercise. You're not actually interested.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with something, I mean, I don't know how they're working now, but something like COVID and people
Mm-hmm.
working from home,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there is a possibility of lawyers being able to choose the hours
Yeah.
they work. Maybe you could have twice as
Mm-hmm.
many lawyers working
Yeah.
half
Yeah.
the hours. I mean, I do think
Yeah.
things are possible, but
Yes.
it's law is certainly an area where maybe people's minds are a bit more conservative or closed
Mm-hmm.
off to
Mm-hmm.
possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, I find that in a lot of these environments, and I think it's too bad, and that if that facilitator had been able to hold that comment inside, I mean, perhaps she was concerned about some expectation that she was never going to be able to meet. And 20
Mm,
years from now, I mean, she certainly isn't responsible, but wouldn't it have been fantastic if she would have really fleshed that out and like, okay, how
yeah.
would we make that happen? What would that look like? What would that allow for lawyers? What would that, all of the positive and the concerns, the negative. I mean, I, as someone who has facilitated, feel like that's such an exciting thing to draw out and get. And again, I
Yeah.
understand it from her perspective too, because you get people excited and engaged in that conversation, and then I've heard the expression trying to turn an aircraft carrier in a bathtub, like that.
Yeah.
That just being really clear that these changes you might not see in your career, but what a fantastic and sad.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, indeed. Shifting slightly, I'm curious to know if I'm asking folks about feedback and about how it maybe, feedback that when you initially heard it at some points or point in your career that was really hard to hear, but that later you were really appreciative of, that it really, was a gift in hindsight.
Ooh,
I feel like I might be catching you off guard. Maybe we can come back to
yeah.
it. Might noodle around in the back of your head.
It's interesting. I've received a lot of really good, as in nice, positive feedback in my career. Right back at the beginning, I think there was some unfair feedback which surprised me, and I questioned, and on questioning, turned out pretty much it had been made up. So that was very annoying.
So you questioned it. Did you,
yes.
How'd you go about that? I think some folks will take it and not press a little bit.
Yeah. So this was back again in that first career of being a barrister. And I suppose I would have to caveat this with saying at the point I got the feedback, I had already made the decision to leave the career, although the person giving the feedback didn't know that at that time.
Okay.
But the way the career works is we have two types of lawyers in the UK: solicitors that instruct the barristers who go to court. And I got some feedback about how there had been some complaints from solicitors about my work. which genuinely shocked me because I had worked so hard and couldn't think of what might have gone wrong or what I might have done. And because this was still going to be an ongoing relationship, I was going to be working for them for at least another 2 or 3 months. I thought, well, I ought to know then what the issue is. So I asked them to give me more details. And it turns out that, yes, it was just more or less made up, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is, I told you it was a very competitive field. I think they were at a point of needing to thin out the numbers of the trainees who would be continuing. And so I think they just made up an excuse, honestly. So I'm glad I clarified that. And I think that confirmed to me, yes, you're doing the right thing, leaving this career, perhaps.
Yeah, I think, just asking for clarification, sounds like that was a pretty neutral ask. In my experience, I've had some acquaintances that have asked for additional information, and it wasn't received well by they were being, it was the boss or whoever was giving the feedback or the input was very surprised, it wasn't okay that they were asking for more detail on that. And I think asking very open-ended questions, can you help me get clear on that, it is really important. And you having the confidence to do it, it sounds like it was bolstered by the fact that you knew you were leaving. And I believe that it can be true for folks early in career, or maybe any point in career, that there's a lot of dependency or the sense that there's nothing else out there, that I have to keep this, some need to really not rock the boat too much because of a sense of insecurity or risk about that. And there's always another opportunity. I mean, anyone I've talked to, of most people, anytime there was this major thing, the door closing, it just led to so many amazing other things. And this brings to a question around the risk that clearly when you moved from corporate to education, I can't imagine a more drastic shift in salary potential than that type of shift. And what that was like for your family. I mean, I don't know, you can tell me what you want there, but just that's huge.
I mean, it ended up, I guess, being life-changing in a number of ways. I'll be honest with you, I had personally ruled out thinking that a move to education would be a possibility for exactly that reason. And so I was exploring other alternatives, but eventually my wife at the time and I agreed that made the most sense. And so there was a degree of trying to save up while the last few months that I was a lawyer. And I think, I suppose, being completely honest, I think when I got to that career in England, the financial side of things didn't surprise me because it was what I expected, but I don't think it really worked for her. And long story short, we came back to America and she's not my wife now.
Right.
But probably for exactly that reason.
Right. And so this is the evolution of life and experience and career. And overall, though, your quality of life right now, I mean, this is, something I was going to bring up a little bit later, but describe that, just if you think about the contrast.
It's amazing. I mean, it feels like it's taken a long time to get here, and it feels like each little bit along the way has been a necessary part of the path. But to be working in America, to be largely in control of the work I do, to be able to do fulfilling work that I'm good at, I can choose who I work with. It's fantastic. So I'm aware that all of the hardships along the way were probably necessary to get here. And it's very hard when you chat to people who are younger and maybe just starting out on a career path, and they have the same, maybe sometimes same questions of what's this all about. And I don't think there are any quick answers. I think you
Mm-hmm.
have to travel a bit and make some mistakes and spend some time doing
Yeah.
different things to end up knowing maybe what works for you. What I will say is, having had this very certain idea of what I wanted to do from the age of 13, and then pursuing that for maybe it was about 10 years, and within a year of that career starting, leaving that gave me tremendous power, because I have never been afraid of leaving a job or a career.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean I'm looking to. I mean, if anything, I think of myself as a very loyal, committed
Mm-hmm.
person.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of people can be really held back by the terrifying fear of what happens if I leave
Mm-hmm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
And that, fortunately for me, because of my experiences, has never really been a factor.
Hmm. It's fascinating that the others that I've spoken to so far for the podcast, and the list is not great at this point, are similar to you, have known what they wanted to do at a fairly young age. And I am completely in contrast with that. And I wonder
Mm.
if I'm going to end up talking to folks who also have had this kind of, me feeling lost in space for an extremely long period of time, and how that manifests. Not to say there isn't still the same kind of choppy, if you will, journey, and what does this mean, and looking in hindsight. But I work with a lot of people in management consulting who do have a pretty clear trajectory of where they're headed, and it's interesting. I wish I could follow them, because I only see them for like their 2 to 3 first years. And, I
Yeah.
want to talk to them 15 years from then and see what's happened, see what's transpired. Of course, I see some of them on LinkedIn and doing incredibly interesting things in the world. So it's all cool. I
Mm.
wanted to say too about feedback.
Mm.
This is totally like not relevant here, but I want to thank you for the feedback that you gave me more than once about the speed at which I tend to talk, like this extremely amped up, almost nervous, or type of tone that ends up coming across, and how it really came to life to me in the podcast when I was listening to the recording. So I do feel like I've slowed down a bit, and I do think it's also part of my nature a little bit to be a little amped and nervous. But your feedback was given with care, so I can actually transition now to what you're doing in terms of helping folks with speaking. I think it's really cool and fascinating, and it's been interesting to see your work through our story group, because with one of our members, listening to his iterations of his own talk, and then a few weeks ago, I listened to the same person's iteration as he stood on a TEDx stage, and the stories were so familiar, but the way that you had kind of helped him craft and hone and tell it in such a much more compelling way, to be frank. Anyway, tell me what you're doing now in terms of speaking and helping folks speak.
Yeah, so I guess I've been involved in the speaking world for a number of years now. When I came to America, I joined Toastmasters almost immediately, which is the organization you can practice public speaking in. And many people join that because they're afraid of speaking. That wasn't my issue. I just really like speaking, so I wanted to do more of it. And I had some success there because they have an international speech contest that they run each year, and I came third in the World Championship of Public Speaking in 2012, and that's a contest that has about 30,000 Toastmasters from around the world that enter. So there are a couple of things that I do with speaking, helping people. One is helping people who are afraid of speaking or need help knowing what to speak about. But then with our friends that you're talking about at the highest level, I love just honing speeches. And one of the things through my contest experience I realized is you can always keep improving speech or improving words, even
Mm-hmm.
when you think, oh, that's fantastic,
Mm-hmm.
there's always somehow a way to make it even better. So I feel that across the full spectrum of speakers, there's something to be
Mm-hmm.
helping them with. And I think right at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned the book that I've been working
Mm-hmm.
on. That's called Last Minute Speaking, and my website will be the same, lastminutespeaking.com. And that came about really, I've been doing a lot of thinking about speaking and how it works. And to my surprise, a number of people, even I think experienced speakers, often seem to struggle with public speaking. And I wondered a bit about this. And so I ended up creating a kind of my own philosophy of what public speaking is. And in a nutshell, I don't think it should be very hard at all. And so even if you don't have much time left to prepare a speech, that's fine, because you don't need much time to prepare a speech. And so that's my whole brand now, is
Mm-hmm.
not encouraging people to leave it to the last minute, but saying rather, if a boss comes along and says to you, hey, can you give a speech tomorrow, that's okay. There's time to sort yourself out and know what you need to present.
Mm-hmm. 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 Awesome. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to reading the book,
Mm.
experiencing the book, and giving it to a handful of people who I know could benefit from it. I really see it in the hands of people who are perhaps already leaders in organizations, but could really improve their delivery.
Yeah.
I'm amazed sometimes at the level of quote unquote success, folks that have moved up the corporate ladder and then, but I can't hear them when they're giving a town hall
Yes.
meeting, or they're mumbling, or why won't they mic that guy? It's like, it's just the level of frustration. So, but I see the book being valuable for so many. So I am definitely going to be your one of your
Great.
number one,
Thank you.
sellers of the service. And also, just like I said, seeing how our friends talk has evolved.
Mm,
So yeah, it's fantastic. I want to shift a little bit, if you don't mind, to
sure.
your family and your childhood and your own family as well. I'm
Mm,
very curious about this. I think that who we become in the world has a lot to do with the environment that we grew up in. The whole nature versus nurture. There is also, of course, the genetic component. And you had described your parents as being hands off, and I'm curious to know what professions are or were.
yeah. So I mean, hands off, not in the sense of they weren't interested. They were very interested in sort of upbringing and education and career, but they trusted
Mm,
us. So, for example, I don't ever remember one of my parents telling me to do my homework.
mm,
I was annoyingly self-motivated, I
mm-hmm,
guess,
mm-hmm.
in that respect. But the funny thing is, I could imagine having resented them
Yeah.
if they told me to. So they trusted me, and I did the job. So my dad had a career working in a bank, just a high street bank,
Mm-hmm,
for many years. And my mum was very much the stay at home
mm-hmm,
mum, which I really appreciated. I know it's quite a traditional,
mm-hmm,
maybe old fashioned model, but I thought it was great, really sort of benefiting from her being around all the time.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And neither of them went to university, although my dad is certainly one of the cleverest people I know, and easily could have gone, and in fact ended up lecturing at a university years later after he'd left his job
Mm-hmm,
with the bank. So I think there was an element of, they wanted my sister and I to go to university,
mm-hmm,
and things are a bit different in the UK to America. That certainly back then wasn't the expectation of everyone needs to go to university, or
mm-hmm,
you're worthless, or or
mm-hmm,
anything like that. It was more of a only maybe I don't know, a quarter or a third of people that finish school would then go on to university, and you'd only go if you had a sort of more specific purpose in mind. So, for example, I wanted to be a lawyer, so I went to go and get a law degree. So yeah, they were a big influence on me. But other than my mum having done the jury duty, I think neither of them guided me towards law or any particular career.
And the self-motivation with school and doing well, were you just really interested in all of the things you were learning, or had you known that, I'm going to go into law, I need to have really good grades in order to get into the next thing?
Yeah, no, I was really interested, which is funny because I now have two teenage children who, for the most part, don't seem to be very interested at much that school has to offer. And it's not something I can really relate to. And I feel like every time I try and throw in something interesting that might have a slight educational value underpinning it, I feel like my kids can see me coming a mile off. Like, wait, we don't want to learn anything. Oh.
Do you think there's something intrinsic to the way that the education is happening, or like if it was me, I don't have children, and so I haven't put them through the American public system, and I myself went to a small Catholic high school and elementary school in Southern California. So my experience with the United States public school system is limited, but I do know that Massachusetts, which is where your children are going to school, that the public education is much better, although it varies by county and a town, I believe, than it is, for example, in Southern California. So, I mean, and you being a teacher, you have a different lens to view this. So I'm curious to your perspective there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could certainly criticize the education system in both the UK and America. I mean, two things they have in common that I think are very much the wrong direction, and these tend to come from the government down. But I think there is far too much testing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it hurts the kids, and from the teacher's perspective, you end up just constantly focusing on the testing, and then when you judge schools and teachers by test and exam results, obviously that's all that matters. So I think that's been a really harmful development in the last 20 years. The other thing that I see in both countries is a diminishing of the value of subjects other than English and math. And the funny thing is, before I became a teacher, I had involvement still in education, and we have this thing where you can be a governor of a school in England, and that they're just members of the public that have a role in overseeing what is done in the school. So I had some involvement that way, and I would have said, oh, there's nothing more important than English and math. After teaching, I'd say, no, it's gone way too far, because none of the other subjects seem to matter. Even something like science is a very poor third to English and math, or ELA and math here. And I think that that's a real loss, because when you have all the other different subjects, you are learning valuable things that they cross-pollinate with each other. I don't know if that's the right expression, but they all benefit. And then there's one criticism I have, which is more, I think, American than English, which is there does seem to be a huge obsession on learning facts here, which I don't necessarily think are that useful. So a classic example would be learning all the state capitals. When I was learning geography growing up, and that was one of my favorite subjects, my geography teachers would have said, that's not geography, that's trivia or general knowledge. Geography is learning about skills and processes and things. And so I do worry that there's too much learning of facts, and of course in history as well. If you can't make the facts relevant, no wonder the kids are not engaged. So that bothers me a bit, but I don't really know what can be done about it.
Yeah. So your experience with the high focus on math and English, and what do you think drives this?
I think a decision has been made, probably political decisions have been made, that they're the two most important subjects. They're the two subjects that assessments, national or statewide assessments, are done in them. And that way you can compare all the kids and you can
Right.
compare all the schools, which, I mean, that's another thing I don't understand. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you want to compare all the
Mm-hmm.
kids? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, as you know, I didn't get educated here, but the idea that at the end of high school, you can rank every kid in grade in order from the
Mm-hmm.
top to the bottom. Well, at
Mm-hmm.
the top, they're very happy for them, but
Mm-hmm.
what's the damage to the people at the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
And you think about things like mental health, and
Right.
that really worries
Right.
me. And so I would rather rank no one, or rank generally, than
Right.
be putting people in a position where it could be, I think, hugely damaging to them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I suppose folks are trying to mitigate something
Mm,
and they think they can simplify it down to these numbers, and
mm,
it, you know, goes back to the testing. And of course, I'm sure that there's so much involved here that I don't know, you know, a minutia, a small
mm,
percentage of, so I don't want to, you know, act as though I know what that is. But I too agree that this ability to cross pollinate and to be well-rounded as human beings is pretty important. And I do feel that this is one of the places where the spark, the wonder, the curiosity is turned down in kids. You know, I think that
yes.
we're all born with this natural interest and, you know, a sense of wonder about the world that school in a lot of cases is shutting down for people.
Yeah, definitely. And it's the saddest thing, really. And you can see it as you move up from elementary to middle school to high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I think partly it's a natural development. I think even we, as we grow up and develop, we doubt our abilities. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I certainly remember my son as a toddler, he thought he was superhuman. I think
Mm-hmm.
he could
Mm-hmm.
do
Right.
anything. And
Yeah.
it's so sad when that gets lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm interested to know if your kids have other creative interests that they dive into.
I mean, they are both creative. My son is quite sporty. He likes to run,
Mm.
but I mean, I can't deny the influence of screens, of
Yeah.
phones, and
Mm-hmm.
video games. And I think, like all kids, it's a slightly different childhood to
Oh,
the one
absolutely.
I had.
Yeah. I have to say that the television screen had a big influence in my
Mm,
life. And I know that it did in a lot of other kids of my generation. You know, I was in high school, mostly in the 80s, and
mm.
TV, even though we only had a small fraction of the programming that we have today, I do think that screen time, you know, probably slowed me down too, in terms of like
Mm,
developing interest in a lot of other things. Well, you talked about the focus on numbers and facts, right? Facts, I
mm.
think, is really what I'm focusing on here. And maybe versus, you know, critical thinking even,
Yeah.
or, you know, what does this say? You know, what is the greater story here? There's so much opportunity even for creativity and education, right? If
Yes.
teachers could only take it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, to be fair to teachers, I don't blame them at all. Actually, I mean, the teachers I worked in Rhode Island here. I've seen, obviously, teachers in Massachusetts who are teaching my kids, and then all the teachers back in England. Almost without exception, they're all wonderful, talented, creative
Mm.
people. They're
Mm-hmm.
just completely tied down
Mm.
by the restrictions that are placed on them.
Mm-hmm.
That, I think, is the tragedy
Hmm.
of this.
Hmm. So there are some handcuffs in the education system, and
Mm, yep.
the handcuffs aren't only limited to the corporate space.
No, no.
It's interesting. And then what about the pandemic? How do you see that? I mean, either talking from the perspective of your own kids, and being forced to stay home for so long. Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
it was very hard on them. I mean, they were both off, um, both online learning for over a year, meaning, how did it work? I think it was something like I last took my son to school when he was 12, and the next time I took him to school he was 14, or
Wow.
something like that. But it was because the year just slightly overlapped the
Mm-hmm.
birthdays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they found it hard, I
Mm-hmm.
think. And I think there's the social piece especially is who
Yeah,
knows? I guess it's going to be a long-term thing, isn't it?
absolutely. Yeah.
And I think we all found it hard too. To me, it
Mm-hmm.
feels there have been great opportunities
Yeah.
because now you can connect with anyone, anywhere in the world, and
Right.
that's been great.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, being behind a screen all the time is not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you want to get out and actually see people for real, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's been interesting re-engaging in the world. And I know that I I feel tired faster. I know that I've always been someone who's more on the introverted side, meaning I am more drained from social interaction generally than charged
Mm,
by it. But I'm finding it is even more draining. And I've been re-engaging since the fall, and it's like I'm having to recalibrate. I
mm.
appreciated the pause, but I'm kind of curious about my ability to engage with the world again. I think I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I want to shift to this kind of last idea or chunk around satisfaction in work. And even to the extent that it makes sense for you being valued at work. And you talked about
Mm.
appreciation in the corporate law job, but did you have satisfying days when you were the barrister or in that space? And then, teacher now, just kind of looking for themes that characterize the most satisfying work experiences.
Yeah, I think for me, for work to be satisfying, it it needs to feel worthwhile. I need to feel that I've done a good job. And I suppose on some level for there to be recognition, it doesn't necessarily need to be praise. So I remember, for example, a very early on case that I did in the magistrates court as a barrister. I was representing a 14-year-old so he was being tried in the youth court, and he had broken into a car and been arrested by police there. And he he was from the Asian community in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember advising him and saying, well, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is the case against you is watertight.
Mm-hmm.
So your only option is really to plead guilty. But the good news is, because it's the first time you've done this, you'll get what's called a conditional discharge. So
Mm-hmm.
no real sentence, so to speak. But he wouldn't accept that. He wouldn't accept his guilt. And I met him a number of times, and his parents, who were lovely. And I didn't understand what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then, to make matters worse, the judge, or the magistrate that we were in front of, was someone who was known for very harsh sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole way through so we had a trial, the whole way through the quick trial, the judge was shaking his head. And I thought, oh, this is a disaster. What's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And it came to sentencing, and he was about to sentence the boy. And I interrupted because I hadn't yet had a chance to speak on behalf of him. And I was able to say to the judge that I think what was happening here was that the boy was more afraid of admitting to his parents what he'd done,
Mm-hmm.
because they were very respectable, than actually in the court of law owning up to what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw this sort of spark in the judge's eyes, and he realized the truth, I think, of what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I can't believe I'm doing this. To the boy, you're so lucky to have the lawyer you have, but I'm going to give you that conditional discharge.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a moment of, wow, I made a difference
Mm-hmm.
someone's life, and you don't always get that very
Right.
often. Now, I've told that story in America and often got the response of, wait, he committed a crime and you got him off. That's
Yeah.
what's that about? But that was the job. I think as a teacher, of course, you almost daily get these moments of making a difference in kids' lives, seeing
Yeah.
them light up as you can
Right.
explain something
Mm-hmm.
to them.
Mm-hmm.
So anything like that. In terms of the corporate jobs that I've done, that was a lot harder because at
Yeah.
the end of the day, it was probably getting the deal done. And
Mm-hmm.
and really most of the deals were about money.
Yeah.
So there was a sense in which it was, oh, we made some people richer somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Great. It not to say it wasn't meaningful, but I think it's hard for me to say it felt as meaningful
Mm-hmm.
as someone's liberty or a kid's education, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And now in helping individuals with their speeches, I think you may have already, maybe you've already, kind of spoke to this,
But
but
I mean,
what characterizes the best of your day there?
well, again, it can be a multitude of things, but if it's someone who's doubting their ability to give the speech, it's just helping them with the confidence and showing them how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's moved beyond that, then
Mm-hmm.
it's the sort of making them be able to give the very best speech that they can.
Mm-hmm.
If they're then presenting, of course, it's their success, which is
Mm-hmm.
wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Them feeding back, yep,
Yeah.
it went great. Everyone
Yeah.
loved what I had to say, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's just hugely rewarding.
Yeah, you shared with that story group the story of your son speaking at your wedding last summer.
Yes,
And
yeah.
that was just, I mean, I'm kind of swelling up on the inside remembering it, that he was putting it off, putting it right.
Yep,
and
yep.
and then eventually you kind of just helped him think through the simple points of it, and that you witnessed him kind of like going over it in his head, and
Yeah.
that he was eventually looking forward to it, would you even
Yes.
say? And then I know that it was just a phenomenal, out that you feel like he got more attention and praise for his performance in the wedding than you and your wife.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, he was absolutely the highlight. And yes, so you're right. For 10 months he did nothing. And we got to 3 days before the wedding, at which point I'm saying, look, you don't have to speak. Didn't want him to have a terrible experience.
Right.
But and it was, again, because he thought it was like work, and he thought, I've got to write a speech. And I said, no, you don't. You just have to have something to say, and then think about how you're going to say it, the routes that you're going to take in your speech. And again, seeing the light go off in his eyes, go on in his eyes, and then just took him a couple of days, and he was amazing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That is fantastic. Well, Stuart, as always, it's been a delight to chat today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I have really enjoyed this so much.
Yeah, great. And tell folks how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so my new website coming out, lastminutespeaking.com, and the book with the same name, Last Minute Speaking, or else contact me, stuartpink@gmail.com.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, until next time, Stuart, we'll talk soon, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There you have it. This episode with Stuart Pink is in the books. If you have any questions or comments, anything from the episode, anything more broadly, anything you wish that I had asked Stuart or that I would talk to other guests about, any stories of your own from the corporate front lines, please send them my way. I'd love to know what's happening in your world and what's hitting with the podcast. What is your unique experience? You can email me at linda@workdopepod.com. That's linda@workdopepod.com. workdopepod.com. You can record something on your phone. Maybe you have a recording app on your phone. You can do a voice recording and then send me that file. Or you could just send me some text, and maybe we'll even set up some time to chat. Until next time, this is Linda Stacy, and I'm signing off for Work Dope. Have a great week. Bye-bye.